Hey, Jimmy Valentine, that was a really great game-winning score you had there at the sporting event.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that. You can look for that card really soon at Colorado Coins, Cards, and Comics. They got tons of sports memorabilia.
Jimmy Valentine, RKO Radio News. Jimmy, what makes Colorado Coins, Cards, and Comics your favorite comic store in the Colorado area?
I'm telling you, forget about it. A comic collector like me, I can save 20% on a hold slot. Duh. Plus, it's hard for me. I'm on the road all the time. If I want the Amazing Spider-Man and I'm not around, it's in my hold slot.
Jimmy Valentine, what do you have to say about your recent allegations about steroid use?
I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to tell you that if I want to get Magic the Gathering cards, I go to Colorado Coins, Cards, and Comics. The little square Jimmy Jr., he loves those. So go to 6700 Wadsworth Boulevard in Nevada, Colorado. They'll take really good care of you.
Hold on, Jimmy, one more question. Wait,
Jimmy.
no, don't go yet.
Does this sound familiar? You're interested in purchasing that new action figure, but aren't sure if it's worth it?
Well, come check out PlasticExplosion.com, where you can go to find all the latest and greatest action figure previews and reviews.
Every week they'll be bringing you reviews and picks from your favorite collections, such as
DC Universe, Masters of the Universe Classics, Marvel Universe,
Star Wars, Transformers,
and many more.
Come check us out at PlasticExplosion.com. That's PlasticExplosion.com.
For barbecue that can't be beat, try Birdman Barbecue Sauce. Available and original and spicy. These robust, full-flavor sauces have the awesome power to kick your taste buds in their face. And for that smoking taste on everything you eat, try new Birdman Smokin' Rub. Caution! Meat left unrubbed may suffer from flavor performance anxiety. You can pick up Birdman Barbecue at local area Ace Hardware stores, Ruff's Barbecue in Golden, and the Danny Cash Hot Shop off Broadway. You can also like us on Facebook at Birdman BBQ.
Welcome to the podcast. I am Ryan. In front of me is Brad. To my left is
James.
And welcome to another real interview. This week we are interviewing Paul Sammon, who is a film historian.
He is so cool.
He is. And you know what's cool? I love that the film community is so nice to us and sits down with us, because there is an intimidation factor when you're dealing with people that have worked on Blade Runner, that have worked with people on RoboCop and things like that, that you're saying, why would they talk to us? But you learn very quickly that they're just like us, and they love movies like we love movies, and they love to sit down and talk to them.
Yeah.
And this guy wrote an amazing book about just Blade Runner that was 600 pages long.
It's called Future Noir.
Future Noir, which is a great way to describe Blade Runner.
Yeah.
And he has so many stories about the pre-production of Blade Runner. He was brought on really early. He was telling us the story about how he would go to the offices with Ridley Scott, and the offices were horrible while they're pre-planning this movie, and he would shoot documentaries for it. Not only this movie, but RoboCop. He mentioned Return of the Living Dead. Well, I brought that one up.
Yeah.
But he's just a really cool guy and so friendly.
We ended up sort of like moving around when we were going to interview him, and we were trying to make it work, and finally we got some time, and so he could have just sat down and interviewed for a while. No, he sat there for well over an hour, right, Brad? How long is it? It's long. And
so generous with his time.
Totally worth it, because the guy is just a wellspring of great stories. But yeah, just the fact that he was willing to do that and spend that much time with us was so gracious.
It was. So let's go ahead and roll that interview, and then we'll come back after the interview. Are you ready? Cool. Yeah. Welcome to another exciting interview here at Telluride Horror Show. I always want to say Horror Fest, but it's not. It's Horror Show. I'm Ryan. This is James, and we are sitting with
Paul M. Sammon.
Mr. Sammon, welcome to Real Nerds. Thank you for sitting in. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
This is so cool, because just yesterday when we met you and we started talking to you, I was like, this man is a wealth of stories that It was just amazing to talk to you for like 4 minutes, and I was like, oh, this is going to be so exciting. So it's really great to have you on the show.
Yeah,
thanks.
We appreciate it. So you started in movies a really long time ago, so how about you take us on a journey? And how did you get into the movie business, and what did you do before? And Just
A
take us on a journey.
Okay, sure. A really long time ago is kind of a relative term. But when I was in college in 1970, I happened to go, I was in a private college, and I had always been a hardcore film buff and also a literature person. I actually went to college for 2 degrees. I have a degree in abnormal psychology and a degree in English literature. But forget that. I was into like any kind of horror movie that came out or any monster movie that came out, or science fiction or film noir or something that was really experimental, or a Fellini movie or Antonioni or Godard or Truffaut. I mean, because a lot of it just had to do with luck and timing. I was born and came of age in a time when they had things like the golden age of international art cinema, where everyone thought that those directors I just mentioned were going to change the whole face of filmdom. This is long before George Lucas and Spielberg. I mean, this was adult filmmaking that was really pushing the envelope, and that's what you grew up on, right? So that's what I was into, and I happened to be in a class in college where a guy named David L. Wolper, who was a very famous producer, he did Roots, among other things.
Oh, wow.
And a friend of his said, well, come down to the school and just do like a little talk. And so I went to the talk, and afterwards I walked up to him and I said, I'm just a college kid and all that. I'm not in the industry. I don't know anybody. But I just wanted to tell you, I know your stuff and I know your documentaries, and I guess he was surprised that someone knew, not everything, but a lot of what he did. So he said, well, there's this movie being shot by a guy named Douglas Trumbull. And I go, I know who Douglas Trumbull is. He did the slit scan effects for the Stargate at the end of 2001. He looks at me and he goes, you really are into movies. I go, yeah, and he goes, well, he's making his directorial debut, and it was a thing called Silent Running, and it was shot essentially in a decommissioned aircraft carrier in San Pedro, California, and it was being mothballed and it was due for demolition. But they used it for their location to be like the interior of a spacecraft that had one of the last forests of Earth, and it's in orbit around the world because the whole Earth has been covered in concrete, and the forests are now in orbit. And then the word comes up that the government's cut the budget, blow up all the forests. And the guy who is the lead in that, Bruce Dern, snaps, kills the other people on the satellite, and takes off to the rings of Saturn to save the last forest.
Wow.
His only companions are these 3 tiny little robots called Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And inside of those robots were either 3 young men and 1 young woman who were all what they call bilateral amputees, which meant that they had both legs missing, either through a birth defect. One guy had been run over by a train, and I think 2 of them were Vietnam vets. Wow. But they literally walked on their hands. That's how they, did the robots. And my first job in the movie industry, I didn't get paid at all. I was lower than a PA. Was to help suit those guys up, right? And they wouldn't even let me. The first AD on my first day, AD being an assistant director, I see the lunch, being laid out for everybody. I walk over and he puts his hand on my chest and he says, "You can't eat with the crew." He goes, there's craft services table, which is just basically a card table where you have snacks, and he goes, that's where you guys eat, and that was my introduction to the movie business. So, it was good because it taught me the reality, in a sense of it. But to compress, I kind of drifted in and out during the 70s, but I was also doing a lot of writing. I've always had parallel careers. I was writing for magazines like Cinefantastique and Cinefex and old, well-known and well-regarded fanzines like Photon, which no one remembers now. But at the same time, people like Joe Dante, who I didn't know, the director, was writing for these same magazines. John Davison, who is one of the guests here tonight, the producer of RoboCop and Starship Troopers and Airplane and movies like that, he was writing for the same magazine. And one thing led to another, and I wound up working at Disney on The Black Hole. And I wrote a double issue for Cinefantastique. And the next thing I knew, they kind of offered me a job to go down to the Comic-Con in 1978 to promote it. Now, you have to understand that the Comic-Con in 1978 was dinky. You know? It had maybe 2,000 people, and it wasn't the big corporate megalith it is now. And it wasn't, excuse me, as film-centric as it is now. It was more like comic books, and it was more like just craziness, and it was the late 70s, so things were still kind of open and free. But I brought the black hole down, and I was one of the first, what they now call genre marketeers. And another one was a guy named Charlie Lippincott, who brought Star Wars down in 1976. And he wound up being the producer of the first Judge Dredd movie, the one with Sylvester Stallone, right? So anyway, one thing led to another, and I wound up at Universal, and I worked at Universal for 5 years, and I went from being a genre guy to being a junior vice president of domestic publicity special projects, which basically meant nothing except that anything that the rest of the people didn't understand or didn't want to do, I did. You know, so I was kind of like the guy in the corner that they said, "Oh, I don't understand this," or "This is too weird," or "I don't want to get my hands dirty." Oh, wait, Sammon's down there. So I learned, that's how I paid my dues, and wound up working on quite a few films. And at the same time, I helped them start up their electronic press kit department. And so I was out shooting EPKs, which now would be the supplements and DVDs, but this was the video version of those. And I must have directed, written, and produced maybe 100, 150 of those. Wow. And a lot of genre things. Some of them have wound up on DVDs, like one of the RoboCop discs has got one of mine.
You did a Blade Runner, is that one?
Well, no, the Blade Runner one was actually put together by Jeff Walker, who is actually working at Warner Brothers in the same capacity that I was working at Universal and at Orion Pictures. So that's really Jeff Walker's work. Oh, okay. However, we'll get to Blade Runner in a second.
Calm yourself. Calm yourself.
No, it's just, anyway.
And I really am giving you the condensed version of this because it went on for years and years and years. And I was fortunate enough to be at a period in the studio hierarchy where things were flexible. And there was a lot of stuff they didn't understand about science fiction or horror or fantasy. And, I consider myself very eclectic in my tastes. I mean, I love all the genre stuff, but I also love like Herman Melville, and I also like Cormac McCarthy, and I'll also read, I read a lot of mainstream and or what they would call fine literature. Right? Yeah. But I also love just equally, stuff like Reanimator. My benchmark is quality.
Yeah.
If it's good, I like it. So through my writing, which was going on at the same time I was working at the studios, I had met Philip K. Dick for the first time in 1973 when he was doing a lecture at Cal State Fullerton. And at the time, I was actually making my living. I'd just gotten out of college, and I've always been fairly athletic. And I was working as a commercial diver off of Catalina Island in a 40-foot boat that I had, and I was a diver. And I was diving at about 100 feet for a company harvesting by hand the seaweed. And we would work 8 days on and 3 days off. And the only way you could get back and forth from Catalina to the mainland was either take the what they called the boat, or they used to have little seaplanes. And I'm sitting in my little tent because it was really primitive back then. We were all living in 20-man army tents, and there was one water tap, for like 30 guys, and you would rinse your wetsuits off and lay it on the gravel there, but you had to be careful because the rattlesnakes were all there, but we'd eat rattlesnakes. We'd catch them, cut their heads off, and they taste like chicken. They really do.
They do. I've had rattlesnake.
Yeah, rattlesnake really is good.
Rodizio Grill.
Yeah, they're good.
It's delicious.
Yeah, it is. It's very tasty. But this is like we caught them.
Yeah. You didn't have them
on the
door,
boat.
just give it to you. Oh man.
Anyway, so I'm off. It's my first day off, and I pick up the Avalon newspaper, and in tiny type it says, "Noted science fiction author Philip K. Dick will present a lecture on his work at Cal State Fullerton." And it happened to be the next day, and I said, "Oh, hell, I'm there." Right? So I got on a seaplane. I went over to San Pedro. I had enough money at the time where I could afford to rent a car and drive up to Cal State. I found some funky Motel 6 or something where the roaches were bigger than I was, but that didn't bother me. I went and I saw Phil's lecture. It was very short. It was mostly academic and college oriented, but like all fanboys, when it was over, I walked up and I said, first thing I read by you was The Father Thing in 1959, and that little short story completely blew my mind. And I just wanted to tell you, I think you're an excellent author, and I don't think you're just a science fiction author. I think that you got a lot going. And I guess the flattery worked, So he actually gave me his home phone number.
No way.
And so I said, well, okay, but I'm never going to call, right? So a few years go by. And by this point, I'm actually getting more and more into the studio system and also doing a lot more writing. And I happened to go to a cocktail party. Phil didn't go out very much. He was agoraphobic, and he also was ill. He had a heart condition. A lot of people don't know this, but he was from childhood, he was not in the best of health. And there he is at this cocktail party. And I go, you probably don't. And he goes, yeah, you were the diver. And I went, wow, and he said, well, wow. I said, the only reason I remember is because you're the first diver I'd met, and I said, oh, okay. So and I'm a little older now. So it was just, not a friendship, but just an acquaintance.
Yeah.
Well, by 1980, I'm working at Disney, and I'm in the publicity department, as I said, and, bringing the black hole down to the Comic-Con, and I'm starting my career, and I'm also getting a lot of notice for things that I'm doing for Cinefantastique and LA Times and things like Cinefex magazine, and I was writing a lot to support I and my wife, basically. And I see in the trades, Variety says, Dangerous Days, based on the novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Yeah.
It's going to be turned into a major motion picture. And I called up Fred Clark, who is the editor of Cinefantastique, and I said, I'll kill. I'll do anything. I'll just give me, just give me the go ahead, and then I'll say that I'm legit, and I'll see what I can do. He says, okay. The next call I made was to Omni magazine. Now, people don't remember Omni, but it was a very slick, a hard science-oriented magazine that was done by Bob Guccione, who did, Penthouse magazine, and it was
that.
Yeah, exactly. and it was just as slick and just as high end as Penthouse, but it was all hard science.
Yeah.
So I said, look, I'm going to do a lot of reportage for CFQ for this, but I'm going to, if you want, because I've written for them before at Omni, I said, if you want, why don't I do a series of like 3 articles slanted towards you with a more technical, hard-edged approach to it. And I did one on Sid Mead, one on Phil Dick, and one on Ridley Scott. So as early as 1980, I was writing about Blade Runner. It wasn't called Blade Runner yet, And when Ridley Scott got hired, I went over to the place that they had on what they call in L.A. Gower Gulch, because it's on Sunset and Gower, and it's the old Hal Roach Studios where they did the Keystone Cops, comedies and all that. And the Blade Runner production offices is up in the funkiest, you walked up the steps and you worried that you were going to make it to the top because it was like creak, snap, it was awful. And I met with the producer, Michael Dealey, laid out what I wanted to do. I said, hey, here's what I've done in the past, and he looks at me and he goes, you're a little different from most journalists. And I said, well, I'm not really a journalist. I think of myself as a historian, but I'm also in the business. And he goes, you're the first person I've met like this. And I said, oh, there's a few of us around, but I said, I got to be honest with you, I really love Ridley's stuff. And he goes, Alien, right? And I go, yeah, but I saw The Duelists. And a big smile because he goes, oh, you want a 5, because not a whole lot of people. It was at the Royal Theater in Santa Monica, and I saw it when it first came out, and I liked it.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, man, Ridley Scott, this is going to be, really something. So Michael and I got along. He says, okay, come down the hallway and meet Ridley. And Ridley and I talked for 3 hours. Wow. And it wasn't an interview. We just chatted. And, and Ridley's, he's got like laser, intensity. And he's in pre-production. And he's like on the phone and doing stuff. And in between, he'll, talk to me. But he never kicked me out. And he never treated me in any condescending way. And it was like, just an intelligent, focused chat. About a week later, I got a letter from Michael Dealey on Official Blade Runner Stationery that said, we've all talked about it, and they said, whatever you want to do, you can cover this entire movie.
Wow.
They said, just stay out of the way. And I knew what that meant, right?
Yeah.
So I did. And it was a 55-night shoot on the Warner lot, and then about maybe 20 days that they shot in varying places, like an ice house out in Vernon, a meat locker where they did Choose iLab, the Bradbury building, of course, which they redressed the front of, with these barley columns, and, they changed it slightly.
Yeah.
The interior of the Bradbury, the Ennis Brown house, which, of course, is, the very famous Frank Lloyd Wright house. They shot the exteriors. I was around for all that. And then I'd go back to my day job at Universal, and I literally didn't sleep for like about 3 or 4 months. I mean, it was crazy. And I just kept writing. And it all culminated in '82 in not only the Omni articles, but also the Cinefantastique double issue, which really, for some reason, struck a chord. And so I'm all primed to see. I had seen, by the way, because I became friendly with the editor, Terry Rawlings, he would run cuts just for me, because I'd be around all the time, and I'd stick my head in and I'd say, what you got up on the movie L? And he'd say, hey, come on in, and I'd see like sequences cut together, you know, and I'd see stuff that, never got the light of day until Charlie, de Lauzarica put together the 2007 excellent 5, disc set that he did for the 25th anniversary. But I saw all that stuff when they were shooting it. I go to the premiere in Westwood, and it was one of the few places that had the 70mm print version. And it's 8 o'clock on Friday night, opening night of Blade Runner, and there's maybe 14 people in the theater. And I'm like, whoa. And then that stupid narration comes on.
Yeah.
Now, the narration divides a lot of people. I understand that some people like it because, it's the old film noir, type of trope, and it to a certain extent, it helps orient you to that world.
Right.
But it doesn't need it. You don't need that. If you strip that away and you pay attention, you still get it. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the narration always was intended to be there. It was in the very first drafts, and then Harrison Ford came on board. Dustin Hoffman was originally going to play Deckard.
Really?
And, Dustin Hoffman was involved for 3 months. And eventually, they were having readings all the time with him, and he was going to play him like a kind of Ratso Rizzo from Midnight Cowboy, like this tough little bastard, and they just basically there was a lot of dithering going on, and so it just didn't come together. And then through Spielberg, Ridley Scott heard that there was this guy Harrison Ford, and he knew him from Han Solo, of course. But he said that there was this thing coming out, that was, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so they flew to London from L.A. to meet with Harrison, and Harrison literally came off the set wearing the whole outfit. And they had dinner, and they hired him on the spot. And so that's how Harrison Ford got hired. But Harrison Ford reads a script, and he sees all this voiceover. And he goes, I get what you guys are trying to do. This is like the old Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, 40s film noir stuff, But you're talking about a lot of stuff and not showing it. And the stuff I'm reading about showing, it's not showing him being a detective. So that was the big problem at first. And they said, why don't we, and this is the exact opposite of most actors, by the way. Most actors want more dialogue.
Yeah.
Harrison wanted less. He wanted more action. He wanted you to see Deckard detecting, right? And so that all came in. The whole thing with the replicant thing, whether he was a replicant or not, came in very late in the day. And it was kind of a mistake. And Ridley Scott got a little confused because Hampton Fancher, who wrote the first drafts, ended one of his drafts with Deckard at the keyboard of his piano, and all of a sudden his hand clenches up like Roy Batty's. Fade out. And he wanted it to be kind of ambiguous to say, wow, he just did the same thing that, Roy Batty did. Maybe he's a replicant, But it was never meant to be like, laid out, big neon letters with a sign. I am a replicant. Never meant to be that. David Peoples get hired to essentially do a dialogue rewrite and to add a few things, including the detection stuff that, that Harrison wanted. He does a speech towards the end where an original ending is that Rachel and Deckard are on a spinner and they're being pursued by Gaff and another spinner out of the city into this wasteland. And Deckard goes into a voiceover where he says, now I know what it felt like to be chased. Now I knew that, like, Roy Batty and I were in a sense like brothers, trying to find our makers to see how much life we had left. Which was a poetic way of saying I'm just human and, like I'm being pursued, and I empathize with it. Ridley reads it and goes, oh, fucking fantastic. He's a replicant. I get it. and David said, no, I didn't. And really didn't hear it,
Yeah.
So then he goes to Harrison and he goes, we're going to make you a replicant, but we're not ever going to say you're a replicant. Maybe you're a replicant. And Harrison hated the idea. He goes, well, where's the human change? He says, like, Deckard starts as this burnout and he falls in love with these damaged goods. That's how Harrison described the Deckard character to me personally. He used that word more than once, damaged goods. He says, falls in love with this thing, and then gets redeemed and gets his humanity back. Well, that makes no sense if he's like one of them. All that got thrown out, right? But then Ridley, very slyly, while production's going on, kept sticking little things back in and not telling Harrison. And Harrison told me this great story, and it's in my second edition of Future Noir, which was published by Ryan Publishing as a hardcover in 2007, and it has a 10,000-word interview with Harrison Ford at the end of it, which the domestic version of Future Noir does not have. And he lays it all out. Harry lays it all out. And he says that they got to the point where he picks up the tinfoil unicorn, and he looks at it, and he does the scene, and really goes, well, this means that that Gaff was here, and he let you guys live. And Harrison turned, and he said, I don't think so. He says, you're trying to suggest I'm a fucking replicant. And they had this big argument right there, So, whether Ridley has either, isn't that funny? I mean,
awesome.
It's like, so he was like really against this idea, but it was never set in stone. And the whole unicorn dream, that came in very late in the day. It was never scripted, by the way. And the whole thing that you see in the unicorn going through the forest, there's this old thing, it's about like a test for legend. The movie, that's totally untrue.
No, I'm sure.
It was shot exactly for Blade Runner. It was done in a place called Black Park, which is where it's outside of Shepperton Studios, and it's where the old Hammer movies were shot, a lot of them, where they were out in forest with all the ferns and all that. And that was one of the last things shot for the film, never scripted, right? And the whole point was that it was this idea in Ridley's head that nobody really got. That that the way he described it to me, Ridley described it to me, was, look, he said, this movie, in a sense, is about paranoia. And he said, how doctors, if they're surgeons and if they're into like communicable diseases, they'll go through a phase where they think they have the disease. And they get paranoid. And he goes, so that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to be ambiguous and suggest that maybe Deckard is the same thing that he's hunting. Now, Harrison took that to mean, no, yes, I am. But at the beginning, it was never meant to be anything more than a suggestion. Now, time passes, and Ridley either forgets or maybe decides it's more advantageous to say that I always said he was a replicant, but as someone who was there through the whole process, always meant to be a suggestion, never meant to be a reality. In fact, Harrison Ford, in the interview in the second edition of Future Noir that I referred to earlier, addresses that. He says, I have nothing against ambiguity. It's finality that I hate. And that's a direct quote. So he would have been happy to suggest that Deckard was a replicant, but to come right out and say he's a replicant, he hates that. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of people, this is one of the biggest debates about Blade Runner, and for years, 30 years, I've been trying, it's in Future Noir, it was in my things that I did for Omni, it's in the original Cinefantastic thing, that maybe he's a replicant.
Yeah.
It was never meant to be final, but people want to believe what they want to believe. So now everyone, including Ridley Scott, says, "Oh yeah, I always meant him to be but not really." Somebody want to ask me a question after like 25 minutes of nonstop chat?
No, I figured you were just going to keep rolling.
I have a quick question. So You mentioned earlier that there's only 14 people at the premiere of Blade Runner, and it didn't.
Well, this was in Hollywood, in Westwood, actually.
It didn't do as well, but it's really caught on as it's gone along. What do you attribute to the success of Blade Runner after the fact?
There are a number of reasons. The first one was home video, without a doubt. When it came out, you got to remember this. It's so funny because I look back on the summer of '82, which now is considered to be like a golden, genre summer, and I worked on like half of those movies. I did. I was in Conan the Barbarian. I was around when The Thing was being shot, but of course that was somebody else who was. Should we?
I was going to Star Trek 2 also.
Yes.
Nice.
Yep. Star Trek 2 came out. The Road Warrior had come out the year before. Tron, all of these movies, it was just this amazing summer. And I think, in fact, I know one of the biggest problems was that people were expecting a different kind of movie from Blade Runner with Harrison Ford in it. They had seen like Indiana Jones, and then they'd seen, this lighthearted adventure of, and Han Solo, and then they get to this depressive, dark, always raining, future where everything's falling apart, and their hero's an alcoholic who shoots women in the back, and that it just like they weren't ready for it. It was way ahead of its time, and as Ridley has rightly said, sometimes it's just as bad to be ahead of your time as it is to be behind your time, and Blade Runner definitely was a movie ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And also a lot of people, I think, were totally confused by it because it was such like an overwhelming visual avalanche. There's just like, what the hell? It's like this so incredibly detailed future. And I think a lot of people just got lost in it and just, didn't quite get it. And then, of course, there's the 800-pound elephant in the room, which was called E.T.
Yeah.
And E.T. came out. And E.T. just blew everything away, And E.T.'s about this cute little alien that's lost, and the little boy, helps him. And, it's the most Spielberg of Spielberg movies. And Blade Runner is not a Spielberg movie.
Yeah.
So that's why it failed. But then, interestingly enough, one of the guys who ultimately wound up being one of the producers, although he started as a completion bond guarantor, a guy named Jerry Parenchia, bought out the Nelson Film Library. And the Nelson Film Video Library, the rights from Warner Brothers, although they still had them, reverted over to this video company that now one of the producers of Blade Runner owned. So all of a sudden, Blade Runner was playing on early cable TV, and it was also in video stores. It was in horrible pan and scan copies, But all of a sudden, people who hadn't seen it, they could pop it into and this is at the dawn of home video. And they go, whoa, how did I miss this one, right? And it grows and it grows and it grows. And then in 1990, they unearthed the 70-millimeter work print by accident and show it at a festival in L.A., and it's a completely different version of Blade Runner.
Right.
It's the one that they had for the Dallas and the Denver previews in May of 1982. And this was before the voiceover, and it's got different like shots and and all this kind of stuff. And people are going, whoa, there's a whole different Blade Runner out there, right? So the next year, it shows up at the New Art Theater, which is a repertory house in Santa Monica, and it sells out every night. And so what had happened is all of this interest had been building up. And now Ridley Scott is in between doing Thelma and Louise and 1492 Conquest of Paradise, right when this is happening. And they go to him and they say, well, you can finally do the Blade Runner you wanted. And he's fried. He says, look, I really don't have time to deal with this. He says, I'd love to do this. He says, but take out the narration. He says, drop that stupid, bad, phony ending that we had to put in, where they drive off into the mountains, which, by the way, are outtakes from The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah. Wow. No, Ridley actually called Stanley Kubrick. And Kubrick said, you can use anything for that ending except what we used in The Shining. And they're anamorphically different, and they stretched The Shining because, Kubrick liked to shoot in 1:8:5, and Blade Runner is at a much wider aspect ratio. So if you were to squeeze those things back to their proper aspect ratio, you'd see Jack Nicholson's Volkswagen. It's hilarious,
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but that was all because of people panicking because the preview cards came back originally in '82, people being confused, and they thought it was too dark and it had a bad ending, so they stuck on at the last second that stupid happy ending.
Yeah.
So in 1992, Ridley says, take that phony ending out, take the bad narration out, and put my unicorn dream back in, which is where Harrison Ford is, kind of like drunk at the keyboard and like daydreaming, and he has a daydream about a unicorn. And then that's the first indication in 10 years that he might be a replicant, because it ties in with the tinfoil unicorn later. How does Gaff know what his memories are, his dreams are, right?
Right.
But Ridley doesn't really have time to do much else. So Warner Brothers re-releases it and calls it the director's cut. But it's not the director's cut. Not at all. Exactly. So Ridley goes off again, And in 2000, by now, I'm kind of like, I've been writing about this movie for so long over the last 10 years at this point that everyone, it was a cult movie, and I'm kind of like the cult writer about it, right? So finally around 93, I say, there's so much that I didn't say in all the stuff I wrote, and it's getting more popular. I called my agent, because I've written over 30 books in different genres, and I said, let's do a definitive history of Blade Runner and do it what really happened, and not make it a tell-all book, but at the same time talk to as many people as possible, tell everyone how hard it was to make, all the feuds, everyone not liking each other, the money people fighting with each other. The studio actually was fairly supportive, which was odd, because often studios aren't. But, it was a really fascinating story, and Philip K. Dick not liking it and then liking it, and so on and so forth. So I spent 3 years doing the book, and the book came out in 96, and it's never gone out of print. It's in its ninth printing in the United States. It's been in almost 20 territories worldwide. It's kind of funny. I feel like Boris Karloff when he did Frankenstein, because Boris Karloff made 100 and some movies, but everybody remembered Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And I've written 30 books and hundreds of articles and short stories and done anthologies like the Splatterpunks anthologies and the Dead Elvis, the King is Dead thing I did in 95, and I've done a Christmas Carol book, and I'm all over the place, but everybody remembers Feature Noir. But I don't care. I'm happy. That's great.
Yeah.
And honestly, the reason I did it personally was because by then I'd been in the film industry for almost 20-some years. And I had read few books that really told somebody what it's like to make a movie. What it's really like.
Yeah.
Mostly it's like, this, like their tell-all, like The Devil's Candy or, something like that, which is a great book, but it's all about like people being egotistical and mean to each other. But it doesn't explain all the different departments and how, it's a group effort and everybody has their own, agendas and their dramas and their problems and, and how it really all comes together. And that was kind of my secret motive for writing that book. And honestly, I'm so gratified by people that come to me all the time and say how much they love that book, and I'm known for that book. And I'm grateful, but I think really I'm secretly happy because at some level I think it touches them and it shows them what hell and what heaven it is to go and make a big movie. And it's always difficult, but Blade Runner was one of the hardest. It really was. It was a hard shoot, and it turned into a fine classic film.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about RoboCop and Starship Troopers and all that, but before that, I think we need to address what may be a elephant in the room, which is that all of this has stirred up again in the last year with Prometheus coming out and all of these rumors about movies tying together and all of the things that they used elements from Alien and Blade Runner, so clearly the computers are the same, so they must be the same movie.
Well, a lot of these rumors, and of course the now famous Peter Whalen memo that came out in the Blu-ray, as an Easter egg, where he essentially says that Eldon Tyrell was his mentor,
right,
and that they stopped making replicants and instead made robots like David in Prometheus and like Ash in Alien because they're later down the line.
Right.
That all is recent. That's not something that was always in the cards or that people wanted to do. When Ridley finally decided to do Prometheus, there was also concurrently, because Ridley, interestingly enough, Ridley did not care about any of his legacy for a long time because he's forward-thinking.
Yeah.
It took him a long time until like really the mid-'90s to like start to look back and go, oh, I've done all these other movies. Maybe I should like talk about them, or because I know it sounds crazy, but like he was more interested in whatever was in front of him.
Right.
So about a year and a half ago, and I won't say where I heard this, but very reputable, I heard that there was a conscious effort on Ridley's part to incorporate elements of the Alien universe into the sequel to Blade Runner because they both had, in retrospect, thematic similarities.
Yeah.
1, the corporate control. 2, the artificial humans. 3, the deep space exploration that leads into things that, really you shouldn't be involved in. And the off-world colonies, which are in Blade Runner, and you never know really what are they? Are they really good places, or are they just hellholes? And I think that maybe a year and a half ago, there started to be some very active and serious thought about, well, we're going to do Prometheus. And Prometheus is a sequel, but it's not a sequel.
Right.
And it can go in its own direction. But there are elements here that are very similar now, that the way we've decided to go with Prometheus to the original Blade Runner. So let's try to incorporate maybe elements of both of those. My opinion is it could very well work. Certainly all the talent on board is first rate. Hampton Fancher, the original writer, is back. Ridley Scott is Ridley Scott. But and I'm saying this purely as a film buff and a film lover and a historian, lightning in a bottle is very difficult to catch twice. And one of the big reasons in my mind that Blade Runner was always successful, and you don't hear this too often, is that Ridley Scott was very depressed and emotionally very upset about the death of his older brother, Frank, who had died of melanoma. And he was a British merchant marine captain or something like that. But they were very close, and he died very quickly. And Ridley was prepping Dune for Dino De Laurentiis, the one that David Lynch ultimately did. But it was taking a long time. The script wasn't getting there. And Ridley says, I have to do something now. And Ivor Powell, who was the associate producer on Alien and also on Blade Runner and had worked with Ridley for years in his commercials, was the one who originally gave him the first draft of Dangerous Days. And he said, you should look at this again. There's stuff in here. And he goes, okay, I got to work. And so in a sense, that was therapy for him, Blade Runner. But Blade Runner to me is about death. It's not about life. It's not about soul. It's about like the quest for more life, and it's all the finality of it, right? All the replicants die, and the replicants are stand-in for us. They're all looking for their maker, and finally one of them gets to their god, who's Tyrell, and Tyrell says, tough, buddy, you've got this long to live, but, have a good time while you do it. And he kills his god. And now that's very mythic, that's very classical, right? And Deckard, and Rachel, Deckard is fallen in love with something that's going to, die within 4 years. And maybe if he's a replicant, he will too. And everything is saturated in gloom and decay and disintegration and corruption. So for me, the sense of mortality and finality is really what's underneath Blade Runner, and I think that all comes from Ridley. Now, this is totally my opinion, but I don't think that's been discussed enough. And people talk about, this and that, and and Blade Runner does have many levels. I mean, Ridley always used to call it a 700-layer cake, and he used that in reference to the visuals, but also there were clearly some thematic complexity to that movie, which is one of the reasons why it's endured.
Yeah.
And it's also one of the few Ridley Scott movies that really has an emotional kick. I mean, if it's weird in a way, Oh, by the way, it was always meant to be a heavy metal riff. I mean, he said heavy metal, heavy metal, heavy metal, heavy metal. He got introduced to heavy metal when he was making The Duelist by Ivor Powell again, the same guy I mentioned before. And then he fell in love, Ridley, with Mobius's work. And, got Mobius involved in Alien. And by the time that Blade Runner came around, he said, I want to do a heavy metal movie. Wow. So that informs it as well. So there's all these different elements, But for me, it's about the end of life.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that was about a year and a half ago that started happening, because that would have been when they were pretty deep into Prometheus.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you look thematically at what Prometheus is about, I mean, there are almost exact same scenes where people go to their god and say, "How do I get more life?"
Yeah.
I mean, that is the one point where I could
when
see
David
like
goes to the engineer,
yeah.
he rips his head off. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are so many questions about that are to me almost link that movie thematically more with Blade Runner than it even does with Alien. Like
now the problem, and again, and I don't say this to be obnoxious or aggressive or arrogant, but if you start to repeat yourself, there's always a possibility that you end up being your own pastiche.
Yeah.
And so I'm of two minds with this Blade Runner thing. It could be Ridley's crowning jewel. It really could be something spectacular and something worthwhile. But how do you capture all of the elements that happened in 1980 and through 1982 and make them happen again? I mean, they're all accidental. It was all just what was happening then in their lives and in the general culture. And how do you replicate that? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's possible.
Yeah.
But I'm always a bit skeptical, and also I hate remakes. I mean, I'm sorry. I understand why it's an economic necessity.
Yeah.
Studios from the time when I used to be, a suit working in like dozens of pictures, there was still a bit of wiggle room in what you could do in terms of creativity. But now, film studios are very small subdivisions of major multinational corporations,
right.
And they don't care about anything in terms of script or like acting or story. What they care about is, for instance, Sony will spend $300 million on a Spider-Man movie, because if it makes $500 or $600 million, it's not that it goes to the studio; it goes to the Sony stockholders, whose stock then goes up 1, 2, or 3 points, and that's worth billions of dollars. And so it's not in any way, shape, or form attached to the film. The film is of no interest. It's like they're making blenders or pencils or burgers. They don't care.
Yeah.
And there's also this mindset now about what they call the 4 quadrants, which are the 4 age groups, and everything boils down. It's always been a bottom line money business. Everyone knows that, but now it's gotten to the point where the creativity of being able to go off and do something that might in turn lead to something better is so hard.
Yeah.
So hard.
Well, I think
things like Looper that just came out.
Yeah.
That's an anomaly. that got
Yeah.
made. That's.
Oh, yeah.
You don't see a lot of loopers these days.
No, you don't. And I think the good thing is that when you see interviews with Ridley, and I mean, you would know better than we would. We just see what's on the internet, but it seems like he is hesitant to jump into a Blade Runner. Like he's asking the questions, but
I think
not,
he's ready. But Ridley is a very busy man.
Right.
I mean, he has he has what's called RSA, which Ridley Scott Associates, which does the commercials. I think he still has Black Dog, which does the rock videos. He's got Scott Free, which does the films. So man, his calendar is years ahead.
Yeah.
And also he's finishing up The Counselor now. The one that's with
right.
Michael Fassbender and Penelope Cruz, and
Cormac
about
McCarthy.
the Cormac McCarthy original, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, poor Tony Scott, right in the middle of all that.
Yeah.
Which is still a mystery.
Yeah.
I've heard some things which I won't discuss.
No. I don't want to know.
But I'm sure some of the information will come out, But I feel, and I say this with utter sincerity, I feel terrible for Ridley because Ridley is your classic Yorkshireman. He's from the northeast of England, where it's hard scrabble and the most English of the English, where they're tough and they don't show their emotions and they work really hard, and they're just tough guys. They're tough monkeys. But he lost his older brother, and now he's lost his younger brother, and he's the last one, and it must be. I can't even imagine what's going through his mind.
Yeah.
I'm glad that at least he had something that he was working on, so he can
trying to get through it.
do therapy, I guess.
Yeah.
But I have a tremendous amount of sadness and sympathy when it comes to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I met Tony a number of times too, so it was kind of It was a shock.
Yeah, it's one of those
Yeah.
stories you read. You're like, really?
Oh yeah,
That's
I was
crazy.
out of town when it happened. I could not believe it.
Yeah,
I mean, it was
a lot of people couldn't believe it and still
Yeah.
don't.
I mean, because there were interviews. Well, anyway.
I gotta ask you a question because I was reading your bio that they handed out today, and one of my favorite horror movies of all time you worked on, and it's Return of the Living Dead.
Yeah, Dan O'Bannon.
Yeah, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I always understood it as John Russo, who wrote Night of the Living Dead, wrote a script for Return of the Living Dead.
That's correct.
And Dan O'Bannon got it, and he, instead of making it a horror movie, he decided he's going to make it kind of a dark comedy.
Well, yeah, it's tangled, but if there is I think it's called Return to the Living Dead, a documentary that was done last year, and it's 2 hours long, and it's on DVD, and it's the ultimate making of what happened on Return of the Living Dead. Yeah, it's out there. It's out there, and I'm on it. I'm one of the talking heads on it. But I essentially was the Orion rep for that movie. And again, one of those movies that nobody else wanted to deal with, give it to Sammon. But I knew who Dan O'Bannon was,
yeah.
But originally it was going to be done by Tobe Hooper.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And Tobe Hooper was supposed to do it after Life Force. And Life Force dragged on and on and on and on. And Russo had a falling out with George Romero and some of their partners, and kind of like the rights got split up. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems is that the phrase Night of the Living Dead was never trademarked or copyrighted because of the original distributor. And so essentially what happened was Russo went and wrote his own screenplay, which was about a bunch of religious fanatics who were in a kind of like a Amish kind of community who were burning, the living dead. And I remember reading it and thinking it was interesting, but, not all that good. And sorry, Richard. But a company that was run by, who was it? Daly and Gibson and David Hemmings. Hemdale, that's what it was. They got the rights to it. And they gave it to Tobe Hooper. And Tobe was going to do a rewrite and then shoot it. And then that didn't happen. So Dan O'Bannon did the script. And Dan looked at it and said, well, if we're going to do the Return of the Living Dead, and Dan was a very prickly personality. I always got along with him quite well, but Dan didn't get along with a lot of people. Yeah. And part of it was the fact that he was blazingly intelligent and kind of had a really bad experience on Alien, where he essentially got fired off of the production and moved out of London. And so he had a chip on his shoulder to begin with about suits and things like that. But also, Dan suffered from Crohn's disease, which was a terrible intestinal disorder, and it killed him eventually. That's what he died of. And he was ill during the making of that. And he would get better and then he'd get ill. So it was always, you never knew where you were with Dan, And there were other personal problems as well. But he did the script, and he put in the punk stuff. He put in like the sense of humor. He put in the more dark comedy, and kind of really changed the whole story, and turned it into the the thing. Did you know that Night of the Living Dead was real? That it really happened,
That Clue part is so brilliant.
Yeah, well, Clue was the last actor to be hired, and he was hired while they were already shooting, and that was one of the reasons he and Dan had this huge fight during the whole show, because Dan didn't really direct him, and Clue was like an old hand, and Dan could be arrogant and condescending, and Clue didn't like that at all, and there was a lot of friction between those two. But long story short, Tobe couldn't do it, so Hemdale said, well, there's the writer, let him do it. And Dan had been angling to direct for a long time. And then it turned into a very contentious and difficult and short scheduled production. And Linnea Quigley was great. I mean, she was a real trooper. Jewel Shepard caused a lot of problems with a lot of people, and just because of Jewel's personality. But everybody loves Jewel now. That's all gone. Beverly Randolph, who played Tina, was a bit conservative and very much like her character, but a real sweetheart and a good actor. But Dan made her fall down a series of stairs over and over and over, for one shot, which is in the movie, and banged her up so badly that to this day she's not a real big fan of Dan O'Bannon. And Bill Stout, who was the production designer, that was his first credit as a production designer. And Bill and I go back to the early 1970s because we're both from San Diego. And Phil Tippett, Greg Bear, William Stout, we're all about the same age, and we all kind of knew each other when we were fans and just getting started, and then we all went up to L.A. So I always followed Bill's career, and Bill and I had worked on the first 2 Conan movies where he was, doing a lot of design work on that. So Bill and Dan had their frictions, but Bill was like really eternally grateful to Dan for doing that. But the whole idea of the funny zombies and putting in, the punk music and, a lot of that was Dan's, but there were other people who were involved in it too. And then it came out, and it was just like Blade Runner, Nobody went and saw it, and the studio just dumped it. And the famous line, and I say this in the documentary, was we used to have these departmental head meetings at Orion every Friday where the heads of the department, I was a department of 1, so I'd be there, and I remember that the head of production stood up and he says, we have all these movies on our slate coming out and blah, 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 blah. And he sits down and I put my hand up. I go, Charles, his name was Charles Glenn. I said, you forgot Return of the Living Dead. He goes, why would we even talk about Return of the Living Dead? And I said, well, listen, I said, have you seen the dailies? He goes, no. And I said, well, I've been out on the set, and I've been talking this up for like 3 months, and I'm going to cons with it. And, this is actually not a bad film. It's not going to make hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's going to be it's going to make a profit. He looks at me, he goes, Mr. Sammon, we at Orion consider horror movies to be a half step above pornography. And he was completely serious. And he said, we don't want to hear any more from you. And that was it for that meeting. So that's the kind of thing I put up with, when I was there, but I had good experiences too. But then it came out and, it kind of did okay, but then again, home video, and everyone went, hey, this movie rocks, and so finally it found its audience. But what a game, it's just crazy. But in the end, quality usually wins out,
It does. That's one of those movies that, because I'm a zombie movie fan, that I just, the tone of it's so goofy, but
it's serious.
But serious. I mean, I think one of the scariest moments in the movie is those paramedics are talking on the thing, and they shut the door, and then they're just bombarded with these zombies. And it's one of the movies where you can't defeat the zombies.
Right.
I mean, there's that one zombie where they're in the mortuary and about to be burnt, and she's still alive.
Yeah.
And it's a
corpse.
Half corpse. Yeah. And of course, Tarman is amazing.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the capper to the paramedic scene is after they killed the zombie says, "Send more paramedics."
and what people don't know
laugh.
too is that movie started the zombies eating brains. Everyone,
of course,
thinks it's a lot older than that,
and it also had fast zombies.
It
which,
did.
They weren't really around before then. George Romero, why they moved slowly in his movies? Because he said that they were, decayed, and that the ankles would not hold your weight if you were actually decayed. And if you started to run, your ankles would break off and you just fall. So he actually had a reason for having kind of slow. I mean, they move fairly fast, but he still to this day he goes, it just makes no sense. He says, if you're dead and you're decomposing, your legs are going to break.
Well, he has that joke in Diary of the Dead where the film crew is filming, and the director's saying, "Hey, if you're dead, you won't move that fast."
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's right out of George's mouth. He's always been like that. George is a sweetheart, by the way. He's one of a really nice.
Oh man, I love listening to him talk about his movies because he's one of those guys. He just seems so nice and unassuming.
Well, he's also what you would now call an indie filmmaker. I mean, well, seriously. I mean, he, most of his product has been done outside of the system, and when he went into the system, he basically got co-opted and then got out of the system again. Yeah. And some guys, work very well in Hollywood, and some people just should never go close. So, RoboCop or anything?
RoboCop?
I want to ask you two quick questions before we get to I know Brad's dying to get to RoboCop, but first of all, are you still friends with Douglas Trumbull?
I saw Doug the last time in 2007 at the Bradbury Building, where they had the big after. There's a group called the Jules Verne Society that is in Los Angeles, and they're a high-end kind of science fiction fantasy fan group. But they have resources, and they go all the way back to Jules Verne, and they tend to put on very lavish celebrations of all kinds of films. And so they had a screening for the 25th anniversary of Blade Runner. It was at a theater downtown, and I can't remember. Oh, the $1 Million Theater. That's where it was. Yeah, where the outside when Deckard's crossing to go to the Bradbury Building, and you see the Mexican for the $1 Million Theater. I'm pretty sure it was there. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I.
Right.
But anyway, the after party was at the Bradbury, and Warner Brothers had completely done it up with mannequins and lasers and fog machines, and everybody who was everybody was there. And Doug was there, Sean Young was there, Joanna Cassidy was there, Katie Haber was there, Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard, he was there. Shatner was there for a bit. It was just unbelievable. And Doug was there. And, and I walked over and I said, "Remember me?" And he goes, "Robots and Blade Runner." And I go, "Yeah, you got it."
Okay.
So he remembered from Silent Running. So.
I was just curious if you've gotten a chance to see any of his weird, 600 frame per second movies or whatever.
Oh no, he I've forgotten what it was called. Something scan, film scan.
I think it's film scan.
I might not be right on that, but no, he was doing the 60 frame per second process as early as the 1980s and the 1990s, and in fact, I was invited to something at the same theater that they showed the 70 millimeter version of Blade Runner at the Westwood Bruin Theater in Westwood. And they had a demo reel, and right in front of me was Mick Jagger. And I'm serious, because Jagger was a potential investor in this process, and there was only 4 or 5 people, and I saw this little guy come in, after the lights went down, and he plopped down with like 2 or 3 other people, and this guy who was with him, he leans over and he goes, That's Mick Jagger." "Oh, really?" And then he got up and he left. But Doug has been trying to get that going for decades. Yeah. And what's bizarre about it, if you see it, especially on a big screen, it's 3D without 3D. It is so lifelike. It's for about 5 minutes you have to adjust, because it's palpable.
Yeah,
you can reach into the frame. You're not wearing glasses,
right?
So it's if they do it, it would be great. Of course, the problem is then you have to retrofit all your projection booths. Yeah, and now that it's DCP, the digital cinema projection, and now where they just have the hard drives where they just like pop them in, it might be easier to do. Yeah. But more luck to him. He's been trying for a long time to get this thing going. But he's a visionary, and it takes a lot of after-the-fact capital to refit a lot of projection booths around the world, and that's where people start to draw the line.
Yeah, well, and you got to retrain some viewers, because at Comic-Con this year, people saw like the couple of minutes of The Hobbit, and nobody was impressed, but that's because you don't have enough time to get used to it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm interested to see what happens with The Hobbit. Yeah. There it is, weird. Lightning, being in a bottle. Can it happen again?
Well, yeah, exactly. And then right before we go to RoboCop, what is your favorite version of A Christmas Carol?
The Alistair Sim version. Yeah,
1951.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing. He's and I've seen dozens of them. Up to the more recent. I even saw the Kelsey Grammer Right Wing. Have you seen that one? Yeah. It's like it's a liberal bashing Christmas Carol. Yeah. Which is an interesting take. But no, I've always loved the Alistair Sim. I mean, he's a wonderful Scrooge. It's got that good dark Gothic Dickensian atmosphere, and when they really get into it, it's frightening. And you really get this feeling of what a mean, miserable bastard Scrooge is. And at the same time, he goes through very gradually, that that conversion. And of course, Alistair Sim was one of the great eccentrics.
Oh yeah.
And he was such a wonderful actor. And and when he's dancing, doing that jig on Christmas morning,
Label.
Oh yeah. There's so much that's good about that, and it's sad. There's a lot of melancholy in that film as well. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite.
Mickey's Christmas Carol.
That made me so happy just then. Okay, how'd you get involved in RoboCop?
RoboCop was very much like Return of the Living Dead. I was at Orion Pictures, and I was asked to be the publicist on RoboCop. And I had to go to John Davison and saying, well, Dino De Laurentiis has just hired me for the De Laurentiis Group as an executive, and I've left Orion. So I'd love to go and be on location in Dallas with you and be your unit publicist, but in all conscience, I can't do it. I can't believe that you don't want to do this, and because we had met and we'd known each other for a long time, but we really got to know each other on the Twilight Zone movie because Joe Dante, he was the producer of the Joe Dante segment, yeah. And I was on that set with my wife, and I did a long article. I unfortunately was around almost to the helicopter crash, and got to know Vic Morrow, and Jennifer Jason Leigh visited the set when she was only like 13, 14 years old. And John Landis, I was doing a career profile for the old Twilight Zone magazine, which was the cover story, and so I was around a lot for that. But John said, hey, I want you to come work on the first Robo, in production. And I said, I'd love to. And he looks at me and he says, I get the feeling you're going to turn me down. And I go, I have to, because I'm at this other studio now, and it wouldn't be fair. So I go to the other studio. Well, in the interim, that studio blows up. And, it goes out of business because they did a whole bunch of movies. They did great movies like Blue Velvet and Manhunter and, some really good lasting films, but they also did movies like Taipan and, Maximum Overdrive, the Stephen King thing, And Taipan was the one that broke the back of De Laurentiis Entertainment Group.
Wow.
And so suddenly I'm free, and Orion wants me back, and Robo is just about ready to go into post-production. So I get a chance at the very end to go in and see them shooting in Dallas. And then they did a lot of pickup work in San Pedro for the part where Murphy gets his head blown off.
Yeah.
And that's a Rob Bottin puppet, by the way. And also the stuff where Robo slams his hand through the TV monitor that's got the pre-recorded real estate pitch. All that was shot in this funky old auto assembly plant in San Pedro. And I did one of my making ofs. I had my cameraman down there, and I show up and John goes, I thought I didn't hire you. That was his first words. And I go, hey man, I said, I'm back at Orion, and it's like my picture, they assigned it to me. And I said, I'm whatever you want, I'll do. And John and I are like kindred spirits. I mean, we both grew up we're literally within a month of each other's age. And we're both hardcore film nuts. And, we've seen, he has his own thing and I have my own thing, but we've seen a lot together. We go to the movies together all the time. And we went and saw John Carter when it came out, in L.A. Well, it wasn't all that cool.
Well, but
but it was. Yeah, we went and saw it. But John and I, in a sense, we've never lost our childhood love of cinema and film. We were the movie brat generation. And we still just love film. But anyway, so I remember when I met Paul Verhoeven, everyone was saying, watch out for Paul Verhoeven. He's crazy. He's always angry, and this and that. And it was that shot where Robo rams his hand in, and that wasn't an actor. That was actually a prop that was on a big hydraulic press that they could push from behind out of camera and just slam it through that thing, right? So I got my camera guy to do, pickup shots of this, and we can't get an angle because it's a second unit and they're real tight around this thing. And here's Paul Verhoeven's trailer right behind it. And I go over to John and I say, John, if I go in and I knock on Paul Verhoeven's door and ask to go up on top of his trailer with my tripod and shoot this, what do you think he's going to say? And he smiles and he goes, he could say anything. And I said, well, the worst he can do is say no.
Yeah.
And so he had seen me around, Verhoeven had seen me around, and he never talked to me, but he knew I was from the studio. And I knocked on the door, and it flies open, and he had this, like, I remember this really cool leather jacket on, but he looked really tired. This was towards the end of it. He goes, "Vat!" Just like that. He goes, "Vat!" And I go, you've probably seen me around, Mr. Verhoeven. My name is Paul Sammon, and I'm with Orion, and, I'm doing, some of the marketing and the publicity, and this is kind of like, my favorite picture, and I'm your guy at the studio. And he goes, "Well, what are you bothering me for?" And I said, like, you used to shoot documentaries in the Netherlands, right? And he looks at me and goes, "Yeah." And I go, "And you, I'm sure, had times when, you really had to get the shot, right? And everybody said you couldn't get it." And he looks at me and goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Are you sleeping now?" And he goes, "No." He says, "I'm just sitting, reading." And I said, "Oh, are you studying?" He goes, "No, I'm just reading a book." And I said, "Well, would you mind if I and my cameraman crawl up on top of your trailer and put our tripod up and shoot this thing because we need it for the thing?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, sure." And he closes it. And from that moment on, Paul and I have always gotten along. I stay out of his way when he's shooting because, that's one of the things people who aren't in the business understand is that there's a reason why there's so-called A-list directors. I mean, they're world-class professional filmmakers. They have no time for bullshit. Their life is 24/7 on that picture, and everything else, it's just about the picture. So stay out of their way if you can't be with a program, right? But if you are, and if you're like, there to support, and you stay out and maybe make them laugh every now and then, and understand what they're going through, then usually you can, Jim Cameron is like, the really well known for, screaming at people. He won't scream at someone unless there's a reason, though. Jim knows so much about the technical aspects of filmmaking, you can't fool him or bullshit him. And he's got eyes in the back of the head. I mean, if somebody can be up in the perms, or what they call the perms, the rafters of a soundstage, and he might say have a 5K light, and this guy will be up behind Jim, and Jim will yell, "Daniel, that light is not in the right place." And he's, how does he know this, But it's right. It's not in the right place.
Wow.
So they're perfectionists, Now they have different styles of working. And Paul, to my experience, having been on 3 or 4 pictures with him now, normally only explodes when there's a good reason for it. He's going to get what he wants to get, and some people think he's crazy because of that, but I don't. I think he's just doing his job. His job is to put stuff on film that people have never seen before, and he's going to do it. Yeah. So as long as he doesn't kill you, it's all cool.
Cool. Brad, do you have a question?
I do have a question, but he may not have an answer for it. Since you worked at Orion, one of my favorite pictures is Batteries Not Included. Do you have any involvement in that?
Was that an Orion? I thought that was Universal.
Oops, you're right.
I do have a story. My friend Mick Garris, wrote the screenplay for that. Yeah, Mick Garris was very instrumental in getting me into Hollywood. He put in the good word for me at a few studios, and Universal ultimately hired me because of Mick Garris. And so, in fact, when I did the second Splatterpunks anthology that I edited in '95, I think I put Mick's in both of them, but I publicly thanked him. I said, hey, Mick, if it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't be in movies. So, shout out to you, Mick.
His Masters of Horror is awesome.
Masters of Horror is great.
It is.
Yeah, there's some really fabulous stuff.
He has great interviews on FearNet, too, with horror icons.
Sure.
He's just a cool guy.
Yeah, well, Mick's production company is called Nice Guy Productions, and he is a nice guy. Always has been. Yeah.
So, actually, what are you working on next? Like, what's your next big?
Well, I've been working since I shuttle back and forth between literary projects and film projects for 4 years now. There's a woman named Katie Haber who was one of the producers of Blade Runner, and she and I were among maybe 5 or 6 people who were around that production who actually thought while I was being made that it was a good picture. There was a crew revolt, a lot of people thought they didn't get it. They said it was stupid, they just didn't get it. But Katie and Michael Daly, Eva Powell, Terry Rawlings, William Sanderson, Daryl Hannah, and maybe 1 or 2 other people. So let's say a dozen out of a crew of about 200 people, really were behind that picture. So Katie and I, being of like minds, we would hang out and talk a lot, and she's English. We're raised in England. And we got to be friendly, and we kind of kept up the conversation. And years later, we were having dinner, and she goes, I really miss my family. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that your mom and dad died. And she goes, my mom just recently passed, but I don't mean that. I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, I lost my family to the Holocaust. And I go, oh, you did? I didn't realize that. And she goes, well, the thing is I don't know what happened to them. And so essentially for a period of 4 years, she and I found out what happened to them. And they were very highly placed Czech Jews who were among the top artistic people in all of Czechoslovakia. Her uncle was a guy named František Zelenka, and he was one of the Czechoslovakia's greatest graphic arts architects and theatrical designers. And he was famous through all of Eastern Europe. And what happened was in 1943, they put all of the Czech Jews into a ghetto in Prague, and then all of them disappeared. And no one knew what happened to them. Well, it turned out they were all sent to this place called Theresienstadt, which is about 70 miles outside of Prague, and it's an old military garrison that was built in the 1700s by Emperor Franz Joseph II for military guys. And it's a small, self-contained barracks town with this great big, wall around it and a river on the other side. So it's defensible. And what Himmler and Adolf Eichmann and Adolf Hitler did was take all of the artists and all of the painters and all of the actors and all of the psychiatrists, the creme de la creme of the intellectual and the artistic circles of that part of the world, and put them in Terezin. And that was Katie's family. And we found out that that's where they landed. And then we found out there was this whole story that no one knows about this camp. The only propaganda film shot by the Nazis inside a concentration camp. It's called The Fuhrer Gives the Jews the City. And what they did was they sent all of the old people out before they started to shoot this and had them all murdered at Auschwitz. And then they repainted it all and fed them all and brought in a film crew and had them playing volleyball and, swimming and saying, see how nicely we treat our Jewish, friends? And, and turns out that Katie's uncle was the assistant director on that.
No.
And and I'm only giving you a very small part of this, but this is something we've been working on for a long time. It's called the Puppet Box, and it starts with Katie coming home one day. Katie is very much not only in the film business, but she's also always been a social worker and reformer, and she helped form the only cricket club in Southern California, and it's all down in Compton, California, of ex-gangbangers. And they are a world-class cricket club. And they actually tour the world, and she came back from one of these practices, and there was a FedEx box on her step, and inside were a bunch of wooden puppets that were 70 years old. And it turned out that they belonged to her nephew, who had been killed at Auschwitz. And what happened was that box of puppets and toys had been given to the next-door neighbor of this family, and as the Nazis were taking them out, and the mother said, please keep these for Martin, little Martin, and when we come back. Well, they never came back. And these neighbors tracked Katie down to the United States 7 decades later. Wow. And it starts with, these puppets arriving, and we work backwards. Oh, so so that's what we've been doing for now, and unfortunately, publishing being what it is, it's just like the film business. We could do it as an ebook. Amazon has approached us, and we're signed with a really good literary agency, which is called WCA, and out of Toronto. They're one of North America's biggest and most prestigious literary agencies, but they're slow. And they, Life of Pi, the book. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, they bought that, and they're the ones who developed the film. So that gives you an idea, And they're very hot about the Puppet Box, but it's just taking forever to finalize everything. So, we slog along, and I get to go through all of the Nazi documents at the Museum of Tolerance. And by the way, I'm not Jewish. I'm Irish American. I'm Catholic, ex-Catholic. Yeah. Actually, I'm a militant atheist, but that doesn't really matter, But anyway, to answer in a long way, that's what I've been working on for some time now. Yeah.
Very cool.
And I'm writing a lot of fiction. I've written a lot. I've been nominated for World Fantasy Awards and World Horror Awards and stuff like that. But I keep moving, and so like a lot of people stick in one channel, and I've just always been eclectic. And so, I do books, I do movies, I do genre, I do straight stuff. I used to be a musician for many years, had my own band. Used to go around as a folk singer, Hitchhiked across country. I met my wife in 1975 at the Apollo-Soyuz space shot. She'd never been out of Florida. She hitchhiked back with me. We've been together 37 years.
Oh, wow.
So it's, just my life's a little unusual.
What is that old saying? Good stories happen to people who can tell them.
Absolutely.
That's the Irish in me. There's a great old Irish word, blarney.
Wow.
So now I probably used up your next 3 episodes.
Oh, that's
No,
fine.
no,
We
no,
love
no.
it.
It's its
It
own
is
episode. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing answers to awesome questions.
And we didn't even talk about Conan or anything.
I know.
No.
Read, I've got a book out still that's, I think it's actually because of licensing. It may have just been pulled, but Dark Horse had it for many years, and it's over there. It's
Yeah, it's
Conan-
beautiful.
Conan the
It's that
Phenomenon,
well-loved book
yeah.
of Ted's. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book.
Oh, thank you.
I love the art in it. Oh man.
Yeah. Well, it was supposed to be both a visual and a textual representation of the history of the Conan character.
Yeah.
I go to Cross Plains every year, where Robert E. Howard lived and committed suicide in the 30s, and there's about 100 of us from around the world that go there because it is so hard to get to. And it's not like a con per se. It's just like a bunch of like the scholars and the real hardcore people. And we have barbecues, and when we climb the peaks that he used to sit in and like write poetry on. And there are still a few people who are in their 90s who knew him. There in this little tiny Texas town. And I drive from L.A., in my 4-wheeler, and just like then go off into the desert like Monument Valley and hike around there. And, hey, I drove here, from L.A.,
Wow.
So, yeah. So.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you did.
Yes.
Yeah, well, this is great, I mean, Ted's doing a great job here.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
fantastic. It's been so much fun.
Yeah,
It's been-
here's the plug. If anyone has not come to the Telluride Horror Fest, this is the 3rd year, and it happens in October, and you really should come. This is a really special. It's small, but it's wonderful.
It is.
yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah.
It's a good excuse to come to Telluride.
And it's also great to see great horror movies. I mean, the
is.
Elevator, like I saw today, and Errors of the Human Body, which I saw last night, and Devoured, I mean, and there's some quality stuff here. It's just not like, people like with big soup spoons scooping brains out of shit. Although I love that, too, I'm down with
I think that
that.
happened in a Ridley Scott movie.
Yeah, that's true. He fried it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
sat there
man.
with a dopey grin on his face. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sitting down
thank
with
you,
us.
Paul.
Oh, sure,
I
guys.
can't wait to pick up Future Noir. Actually.
Yeah, I know.
And while you're talking, I'm like, I really want to watch Blade Runner right now.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
fine film.
Is there a place online that people can find out about you? Or
Oh, sure. I have a Facebook page, Paul M. Sammon. And if you just Google Paul M. Sammon or Future Noir, The Making of Blade Runner, there's 1 or 2 hits.
There's quite a few pages if you just look them up on Amazon.
There is. We were doing that today.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of. I've been writing professionally for about 40 years now. I'm very fortunate, and
Yeah.
same thing with films. So they were kind of like parallel, but different. I'm one of those incredibly lucky people who got to do what he loved as a child and still does. The only thing I wasn't able to make a career out of was music, but that's cool. Well, because I still love music. It's not like it got polluted with all the the work. I was listening to the Black Keys album on the way up, and the new Pink album on the way up, and what's her name, Ellie Goulding, who is like a kind of a techno electronic dance icon over in Europe, but not here,
Yeah.
And so I'm still very heavily into music, and but for fun.
Awesome.
Very cool.
is there like a certain thing like you always wished you could have gotten into, but you didn't get a chance to?
No, I've learned not to have regrets. Regrets and resentments kill you. I mean, that's just the philosopher in me. I've had a pretty good life. And I was at a period in my life in the 80s when I could have let's just say I could have been, I could have had like one of these $2 million homes around here in Telluride, and I made a conscious decision not to do that. Because I got very close to people like Schwarzenegger and Eastwood and Stallone, and although I Eastwood in particular I love. I think he's a great guy. You know, despite the talking to the empty chair thing. You know, I mean, he's a consummate pro, and he's a good guy. He's down to earth. You know, and there's no bullshit about him. He's a good character. But I lived with the corrosive aspects of fame and celebrity for a couple of decades, and I just decided, for me, it wasn't worth it. You know, there's a great line in Citizen Kane, the old movie, where Everett Sloane, who is kind of one of the goofy associates of Kane, is being interviewed after Charles Foster Kane has died. And they talk about, well, you sure made a lot of money, and Mr. Kane made a lot of money in your lives. And he says, it's easy to make money if all you want to do in life is make money. And for me, I wanted to do more. So I'm perfectly happy with where I am, you know. I mean, sometimes it's nasty when you get snowed on out here and you don't have the right boots or something, you know. But I can live with that.
But if you brought the four-wheel...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I've got my old four-wheel drive. It's got over 200,000 miles on it. It's still going.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm having a good time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
again,
sir.
Paul.
We really
Hey,
appreciate
thank you
it.
guys.
We really
appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank Paul Sammon. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Again, you know what's great is we've had. Remember, he was a lot like George's Jaunty, where he kept on moving him around, and not only did they not get pissed at us, they sat down and still talked to us, and were awesome about it.
Yeah.
So, Paul Sammon, thank you so much, and your knowledge of movies will never be matched.
Yeah.
I mean, when you can write a 600-page book about making of Blade Runner, you have knowledge that, and I love the story about him saying that he thinks Ridley Scott forgot that
Yes.
about Deckard.
Oh
And-
yeah, his whole interpretation of how that the end of that movie changed is really fascinating. And because you can see that he was there documenting it as it happens, you end up kind of going like, oh, this is actually the only guy in the world who knows the actual story.
And if there's one guy who knew, it was definitely Paul. He was the guy who said, you know what?
Exactly.
Because he was in it through the whole planning of the movie.
Right.
So, again, thank you so much. There'll be more of these coming up very shortly.
And hopefully we'll get to talk to him again next year, because as you heard there at the end where he started like spitting out little other stories that he could tell, I was just like, oh, come on.
And of course,
I want to hear all of them.
And then when Brad put in his one question, it was for something that he never did.
You bastard. I was
See,
gonna
now
cut
we
that
talk-
out.
You can't edit
now
it
we
out.
talked about it, so you can't edit it
sorry
out.
about that. Until next time.
That's great.
We are The Real Nerds. You can like us on Facebook, like Paul did. Thank you. You can also tweet us, real_nerds. You can call us 720-6nerds5. Email us, realnerds@gmail.com. We'll read it on the air unless it's a personal message, and we usually don't. If it's a review of a movie, we do.
Yeah.
Anyways. Or if you want us to read it, just make sure I say, hey, you can read this on the air. You guys are fucking dickheads, and we'll read it.
And if you like this interview, tell your friends.
Yeah, tell your friends, because buy his books on Amazon. You can buy all his books on
absolutely.
Amazon. His Conan book, I mentioned it earlier in the week. You can get it at comic shops. I saw it at Mile High Comics this weekend. I've seen it at Coins, Cards, and Comics. I've seen it at Barnes & Noble. His book is beautiful. It's a huge coffee book, and he's written several books, and you should pick him up and buy him on Amazon. And I'm pretty sure you can get them personalized if you buy them from him directly.
And it's almost Christmas time, and he wrote a book about it's trivia about the Christmas about a Christmas Carol. So go check that out. Give it to somebody.
Oh yeah, what's his favorite Christmas Carol?
I believe it's mine, the Alistair Sim version.
Yes. So that was also.
That made me so happy.
I know, that's great. Anyways, we'll stop talking about the interview you just listened to.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.